Hello class, this is probably going to be the last part of chapter 52. We ended the part 3 with talking about abiotic limitations. One of the biggest abiotic limitation is going to be space. When you have animals living, any animal in order to survive needs food, if it's a human being, clothing, and shelter. Shelter here could mean area that it is going to live in, area where it hunts or grazes. It could also mean, that means it needs a certain amount of space to reproduce, take care of its little ones. Again, I am here kind of limiting taking care of little ones to animals that have parental investment, but that does not mean that plants don't need space for their offsprings to grow and stuff like that. They also need space. So anytime, since we're talking about vertebrates and invertebrates, anytime an animal has territoriality, that means they have marked an area, pissed on the post and marked an area for themselves. That in itself is a limitation. And so if the density of the number of animals increases, again, as animals and even plants live in very, very close quarters, there is a greater possibility of predatory behavior happening. There is a greater possibility of pathogens spreading, which will bring down their density. Cheetahs are really, really, really predatory, the predatory animal, obviously. They are also very territorial. And as you can see, the little boy is pissing on the tree so he can mark his territory. Especially males mark their territory. They also, that way they provide protection, provide place for the females to produce their offsprings. Anytime a new male comes into their territory, it is a fight to the finish kind of a situation. Now, when I mean finish, I don't mean that the losing one is going to die, but the losing one has to leave the territory. If the losing one is a different male than the one that sired all the babies, then the male coming in is going to land up killing all the little ones because genetically they are not his. That under no circumstance is behavior condonable for human beings. Don't go around killing other people's babies. Birds that need place for nesting obviously also exhibit a lot of territorial behavior. Same reasons as the cheetah, space is required, you know. There is a certain amount of parental investment. So one of the ways to realize if an animal is going to be territorial is to look at what the parental investment is. When I say parental investment, that means how much of care is required for the offspring to actually be independent. Population, this is what we were just talking about when I said population density. Density of a population directly influences how quickly a pathogen spreads. For example, I think in the previous videos I talked about it. If you have a disease that's spreading within an urban sprawl, it's going to spread much faster than in rural setting. Why? Because people live in close quarters, so pathogens have a way of going from person to person. The other thing is, as soon as the density of let's say the density of deer increases, the predatory behavior of the animals that prey on them is also going to be preferential towards the deer. For example, if you're in Connecticut and the deer population increases a lot, the biggest predator of the deer is the freeway and cars. You're gonna hit more deers than you hit any other animal. When we talk about the growth curve, one of the things that we talked about why things go into, especially in terms of, we were looking at it in terms of prokaryotes, why things would go into a death phase is whatever waste is generated by that organism eventually turns toxic to that organism. So if you have animals living within a certain space and there is a lot of byproducts created because of the animals dying, because of poop being created, because of urine and all of those other things. Those things eventually turn up to become places where there's a large accumulation of pathogens, and that eventually turns up to be very deadly to the population itself. So the amount of toxic waste, now when we say toxic, not all everything toxic does not always mean that it's chemical and it's like a byproduct of an industry. If you have a place that's accumulating with poop, it produces methane gas, and that's toxic too. If you have organisms living within a container and doing fermentation and thus producing ethanol and carbon dioxide, as the concentration of ethanol and carbon dioxide increases, that is toxic to the survival. The definition of the word toxic is, sometimes we tend to look at it very narrowly and look at it as only inorganic chemical waste byproducts, but that is not actually true. The word toxic means something that's harmful to the living organism. Sometimes intrinsic factors also regulate population. For example, if you have a good mating season and there are a large number of young ones, it's difficult to provide food for all of them. Some of them are going to die of weakness. Or if you have if you've had dogs at home, you'll realize that puppies, if you have if you have like a litter of puppies and you have like 13, 14, 15 puppies, the last few, the runt, they don't get enough nutrients in vitro and they tend to die out early. So it's always better to have smaller litter. So population dynamics, when we study population dynamics, we're actually studying the interaction of both abiotic and biotic features, which I think we went over in detail just in the previous slides. We did this exercise in the a similar exercise in your apes class. So you'll notice by this graph that every time there was a decline in the population of the wolves, there was a decline in the population of the goats, because culling is kind of important for any for the survival of any organism. No, that's yeah. You see the similar kind of fluctuation. This is you see fluctuation with temperature and climate. If it's very cold, you'll have a lower population. If you have a particularly warm year, you might have, depending on the animal, you might have a bit better population numbers. Metapopulation is basically where you're just looking at rough population dynamics. You're just looking at adding the birth rate and subtracting the death rate. But actually, if you want to get an actual number of how the populations are linked to each other and how they influence each other's density, you have to add immigration and emigration. Immigration and emigration is actually very important for the strength of the genetic material that is present within a population. We will talk about this in the next few, actually when we talk about evolution, we'll talk about genetic drift. When you have a new organism coming from a different place into an already existing population, they bring along with them new genes, new characteristics, maybe a new adaptability of something that's already there, maybe a resistance to a disease. So all of these things, and then once they start mating with the population within that area, it actually increases the fitness of the existing population. But this is not always true that they're always only going to bring fitness. Sometimes they might actually bring disease. That is entirely possible. This is also called genetic drift, and we'll talk about genetic drift and bottleneck effect and all of that in the later chapters. This should be pretty self-explanatory. As the snow leopard population increases, what is happening to the population of the lynx? Should be able to answer that. If you can't, come see me in class. I think we've talked very much in detail about why there is an exponential increase in population of human beings, but can this population grow indefinitely? No, because the same biotic and abiotic factors that we talked about in the previous slides is also going to affect human beings. However, we are smarter, for a lack of a better word, and are able to combat and cope with certain changes that happen. For example, if there's a pathogen that's devastating a population, we do have cures for it. And this is very interesting. You'll see this little dip in the population growth, and that's because of the plague. Kind of interesting. And we have grown exponentially. We're still growing. Again, these numbers are from 2003, as you see. There is a prediction that our growth rate might slow down, but at present, this prediction is not holding up because our population is actually growing still exponentially. The population, in absolute numbers, our population is still growing. What's not our growth rate has gone down due to certain countries where, if you think about countries like Japan and stuff like that, they have a negative growth. So our growth rate has gone down, but that doesn't mean that the absolute number of populations have gone down. Same thing we've talked about. Zero population growth would be when you have high birth rate and high death rate. A good example for this is the sub-Saharan African countries, where they do have high birth rates, but they also have high death rates. Again, you look at zero population growth with low birth rates as well as low death rates. Japan is a very good example for this. There are very, very few babies being born. They also, on the longevity scale, they're also pretty high. So their old people live forever and their young people are not born. In the sub-Saharan Africa, you find a lot of young people being born because they are still a labor-intensive community. So you'll see a lot of babies being born, but I think countries like Chad that are torn by civil wars, their lifespan is somewhere between 49 and 53. Demographic transition. This is a good example for you to see how different countries with different levels of development have different birth rates and death rates. Again, countries that are essentially very agrarian, very labor intensive markets tend to have high birth rates, and similar societies also don't have very good medical care, so then they have high death rates. Demographic transition is what we just talked about. This is very interesting growth rate. You'll see for any population to survive, this is more of an economics thing, for any population to survive, for the old people to survive, the Social Security benefits and all of those things to help out, you have to have a good base of young people. America, we're slowly tilting towards that, where the growth rate is slowing down. In countries like Italy, you're actually seeing a decrease, because as you see here, the birth rate is much less than the people who should be dying off here. Whereas in a country like Afghanistan, huge birth rates and death rates are also steadily decreasing. Again, like I was saying, developed countries tend to have lower infant mortality and higher life expectancy, whereas that is why a low birth rate and a low death rate, both those things are seen in a very developed country like Japan. You're going to see very low death rates. So the life expectancy is much greater in a country like Japan. And similarly, when babies are born, they have better medical care. The the economic status of the parent is much greater. They have smaller brood sizes, so they are able to take care of their babies better.